Hello and welcome to the Horror Homestead. My name is GiBi, and this video is part of an ongoing series where we dissect the Fazbear Frights series of Five Nights at Freddy's novels. We're going to summarize, analyze, and theorize about each individual story. In this video, we're going to talk about the story Room for One More, which is the second story in the physical book 1:35 AM. It's written by Andrea Wagner, who also wrote Lonely Freddy. This is the shortest story so far, at only 54 pages. And I don't hate it. It's not for me. I don't really like it, but I don't hate it. Before we talk about the story, we have to talk about the internet's reaction to the story. This has been labeled as fetish material, specifically inflation and vor. I need to say right now that I don't think that's actually in the story. This is a body horror story where somebody gets seriously injured. That's what's scary about it. It's disgusting. Unlike other media that absolutely does exist to include this kind of fetish thing, I don't think that that's in this book intentionally. I think that people started saying that ironically because it involves someone ingesting things, and so they started ironically calling it the vor story. And then that spread to people who hadn't actually read it, and it became known as the vor story, or the inflation story. But I don't think it's actually intended to be like that. I want to get that out of the way right now, because if I didn't, it would be the only thing some people are thinking about. Alright, let's talk about the summary. Stanley is a man. He's 25 years old, and he's our protagonist. He's been working somewhere. It's the sister location bunker, or the Fazbear Frights version of that, and he's been there for about a year and a half. His dad died, his long-term girlfriend Amber broke up with him, so now he's living on his own, working nights at this weird place he doesn't understand. He specifically states that besides his interview, he's never seen another living person there. He's also never seen a dead person there. It's just an expression. He's never seen a person there. He just goes, he gets his money, he just watches cameras, never sees anything. I also think it's important to note that he doesn't see the animatronics on the camera. It's not like FNAF 1 where you're standing there and watching the animatronics. He literally just sees empty hallways on his cameras. Although the guy hiring him does say his job is to make sure nothing gets out. Not no one. Not nobody. So yes, it is about the animatronics. Theoretically, the animatronics are still there. Obviously, we know the mini arenas are there. The timeline's a whole thing. We'll kind of talk about it later. The location is underground. Stanley thinks it's a factory. We keep hearing about this bin at the entrance that smells like decaying flesh. It's called the bio bin. And I think that's probably one of the things that Scott told the author to include in the story, but didn't tell them why. So the book just keeps mentioning that this bin smells like decaying flesh. Ooh, isn't that scary? If this is the sister location bunker, then it's not laid out the way that we understand it to be in the game. Stanley walks down some halls, Stan scans his ID badge at the security office, which is a room that we do not see in the games. That's not William's secret room with the monitors. It's also not the room that we see as Mike throughout the game. It's a room that we've never seen before. It's described as being at the end of a long hallway. It's not in a huge room with a stage. So not either of the two rooms that we're familiar with from Sister Location. Anyway, so when he was originally interviewed, he describes the person interviewing him as a bald man with a too large suit. Too large suit, and also interviewing people to be circus babies, whatever, makes me think that this is William, because in the Silver Eyes, William was described as fat before the MCI, but then he lost a lot of weight. So maybe that's why the suit's too big. Also, maybe William is a bald king. All this, like, FNAF timeline stuff should be in the analysis section, but I think this is important before we talk about the story to figure out kind of when this is taking place. The idea is that if William was interviewing him a year and a half ago for this position, then this story can't take place that far after the spring locking incident. It kind of makes it seem like it would also have to be before FNAF 2, because it's assumed that William is, like, wanted by the police directly after the events of FNAF 2. And also, it can't happen after Sister Location because there are mini arenas who would all have escaped into Molten Freddy if it was after Sister Location. So it seemingly takes place before FNAF 2, and so like this would happen before anything else in the timeline really happened. Either way, no matter where we're placing all these events, this is happening in the 80s. Unlike the other stories that we've read so far which take place in modern day, this is almost certainly happening in the 80s. It also mentions the snack space, which is where Oz's dad works in Into the Pit. So this is Stitch Line adjacent. I don't know if a lot of people consider it to be part of the Stitch Line, but it does mention something that's in the Stitch Line. It also probably means it takes place in the same town as Into the Pit, because it has a snack space, and if William is working here in his circus baby bunker, it would probably also be the town where the Freddy's at the MCI happened. Alright, let's actually talk about the story now. The previous security guard before Stanley passed away suddenly from a massive heart attack. Yeah, okay. Whenever he's done with his shift, Stanley will leave work and go across the street to the city diner. He's friendly with one of the waitresses there. He then goes back to his apartment. He's all sad because his girlfriend's gone, so he's lonely. His nephew's birthday party comes up, and his brother-in-law mentions that he saw his ex on a date with the manager of the snack space. And this is where we hear about the snack space. One day, Stanley's at work, he's napping, and then he's awoken not by the sound of an alarm clock, but by one of the motion alarms going off. In the book, this is a beeping sound. In the game, it's a voice that says motion detected, so this is another difference from the game. Anyway, now that he's awake, he sees a mysterious little doll on his desk. It's a mini Reena. We, the reader, knows that, but him, the mans, doesn't knows that. I think the main thing that doesn't work in this story is that we, the reader, know what's going on long before he does. This is also the issue with Lonely Freddy. It's not until the last 3 pages that Stanley figures out what's going on, but from this point, we know the mini Reenas are haunted. They're probably gonna do something to him. We get these long paragraphs about him feeling weird, like there's something in his throat. Well, we know that mini Reenas will crawl inside the masks of the Springlock suit and sister location. So maybe the mini Reenas are crawling down his throat. That is what happens, but we the reader know that, and him the character doesn't. It's just frustrating. Again, it was the same thing that happened in Lonely Freddy. Anyway, so the mini Reena that's on the desk in front of him talks, and it says, "We like you. I like being close to you. You're so warm and squishy. Take me home with you." He thinks it's a doll that, like, when you move it, it talks, not that it's haunted. These lines will also be repeated throughout the story, and obviously right now it's like a cute little thing that this little dolly is saying, and then at the end of the story, when you find out that they're inside Stanley, it becomes like this horrific thing. Oh my god, your organs are warm and squishy. We love being with you. Take us home with you. We're inside your body. Stanley falls asleep while he's at work. He dreams he's at a restaurant eating spaghetti. He then sees his ex-girlfriend at another table with a man in a suit who's probably the manager of the snack space, and then he doesn't want to look at her anymore, so he looks around the restaurant and sees a casket with his dead father in it. So that's his 2 biggest issues right now, his dead dad and his girlfriend breaking up with him, and he's like coping with this by eating a lot, which will also be a thing in the story. He wakes up, and the mini Reena is gone. He doesn't really understand it, but he thinks he's gonna write a report saying, hey, this happened, and then realizes, wait, I can't just write a report saying this happened, because that would mean I have to tell my boss I fell asleep twice on the job, so he doesn't tell anyone. We then get this really good, sad paragraph. If Amber were still around, he would have a story to tell about something interesting that happened at work for once. These were some of the saddest moments of Stanley's already sad days, when he'd think, wait, I'll tell Amber, and then remember that there was no Amber to tell. Ouch. My heart's broken. Stanley leaves, he passes the smelly bio-waste bin, he goes to the diner, it's hard to eat because his throat is mysteriously sore. He goes home, he goes to sleep. He doesn't have any dreams, which I think is interesting because he will continue to have weird dreams at work, but the book specifically says he does not have dreams when he's at home. His sore throat gets worse, and now his left arm hurts, which is no good. In real life, if your left arm hurts, you might be having a heart issue. Get that checked. He goes to work. There's a mini Reena on the desk. He takes a nap. He has a dream that he's outside his apartment, but the street he's on is named Fazbear Avenue. A cab picks him up, and it's driven by Funtime Foxy, who then attacks him. Again, he doesn't know it's Funtime Foxy. He just is described as us knowing that he's Funtime Foxy. When he wakes up, the mini Reena is gone again. This is really interesting for me to wonder, because, like, is he having these dreams because there are mini Reenas inside him? The mini Reenas would have the remnant from Molten MCI, and so he would have remnant which could make him dream about the Funtime animatronics, because now the remnant's physically inside his body. Although if that was the case, it should be happening at home too, but it's only happening at the sister location. But if it's something like nightmare gas or whatever inside that building, why didn't he have these dreams before the mini Reena started going inside him? I don't know. I think it probably is the fact that the mini Reenas are inside him, because in the Silver Eyes novels, if you get injected with remnant, you can then, like, talk to the spirits, and I have this whole thing where I think in the games when Mike is injected with the scoop, his ability to talk with the spirits happens. It's a conspiracy. But that's a whole other thing. I have a feeling that this story in particular, and my coverage of it, are incomprehensible to people who don't know FNAF lore. Anyway, Stanley refuses to go to the doctor because his dad went to the doctor before he died of cancer, and he blames the doctor for that, I guess. This is probably the best body horror paragraph in the book, and is also why I don't think it's literally supposed to be a vor fetish story. It's just terrible. Let's enjoy it together. With difficulty, he dragged himself out of bed and into the bathroom. He looked in the mirror to survey the damage, which was quite significant. Dark shadows had formed under his bloodshot eyes, and his skin had an unhealthy grayish cast. What worried him most, though, was his right arm. Like his left, it was now so swollen that the sleeve of his uniform was like the casing of a fat sausage. He didn't know if he'd be able to take the shirt off without ripping it, probably best just to leave it on for now. He splashed some water on his face, and managed to control his numb right arm enough to run a comb through his hair, and squeeze some toothpaste onto his toothbrush. Brushing his teeth was so excruciating that tears sprang into his eyes. His throat felt like an open wound, and the inside of his mouth was also raw and inflamed. When he rinsed his mouth and spat out the water, it was streaked with red ribbons of blood. He looked at himself in the mirror again. The grooming he had been able to manage hadn't made much of an improvement. His chin and jaw were shadowed with stubble, and he didn't trust his numb arm enough to use a razor. Just that whole thing obviously is like distressing, and then the ending part where he doesn't trust his arm enough to use a razor, I don't know, it gets me. Stanley's sister Melissa then comes over because he's sick, and she comments that, "You look like death holding a cracker," as Granny used to say. I'm now imagining Millie falling in love with Stanley sitting there in his button-down shirt that is too tight and his grayish pale face because he looks like death and she's in love with death. He's got his neck beard, he's got his greasy shirt on, and she's just like, I want that. Anyway, I'd never heard the expression death holding a cracker. I might be wrong in saying this, but the only thing I could find was death eating a cracker. This could be a legitimate variation, or it could be something made for the book. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe they thought that death eating a cracker would give away the ending too much, that he's literally eating the mini Reenas. I don't know. Stanley goes to work again, sees a mini Reena on his desk, takes a nap, he wakes up, the mini Reena's gone. The nap he took included a dream where the power goes out. He goes to the security office and he's attacked by Funtime Freddy. This is not what happens to Mike and Sister location, it's a different thing, and also Bon Bon's not there. I'll spare you descriptions of body horror for the rest of the story, just assume that it keeps going, explaining how he's feeling worse and worse and worse. Stanley's mom comes to check on him, he's getting worse, but he's hiding it from his family. He's kind of coming around to the idea that he needs to make some serious changes in his life, maybe get a different job, meet some new people, etc. He's just so lonely without his girlfriend and in his job where there's literally no other humans. The back of the book says, "The callous world of Five Nights at Freddy's, it's always in the depth of loneliness when evil creeps in." And he's explicitly said to be lonely, and there's literally evil creeping into his physical body. He's getting worse and worse and worse, and then he goes to work. And then we get an interesting paragraph from the perspective of Frights fiction enjoyers. He staggered and stumbled down the sidewalk. Passers-by stared, some seeming worried, others just annoyed, like it inconvenienced them to see another person suffering. It's Mike and Sister location, only from a Fazbear fiction Frights thing, or something. He gets to work, he realizes he might die, and so he writes out a letter to Amber about how sorry he is for the way that their relationship went. I will talk about this in the analysis section. He sees a mini Reena, but this one is missing one of its arms. This is when he makes the connection that, actually, all the mini Reenas he'd been seeing on each night had minor differences. One of them had a bent tutu, one of them had a scratch on its face, and he finally realizes that the mini Reenas were all different physical items, not the same one coming to visit him. He takes it and he shoves it in a drawer and he thinks out of sight, out of mind, which is obviously the wrong thing to think because the ones in his body are also out of sight, but they're definitely not out of mind. He falls asleep and he has a dream that he's at the dentist, and the dentist assistant is Ballora, and they open his mouth real wide, and then he wakes up and sees the mini Reena opening his mouth real wide to crawl in. He finally realizes what's happening, and then we get the ending. No wonder it hurt too much to eat or drink anything. Night after night, the dolls had been climbing into his mouth and down his throat as he slept, making their way through the narrow passageways of his body like explorers in a dark, damp cave. The realization nauseated him. He felt the urge to vomit, but there was nothing in his stomach to bring up. Nothing but acid and fear. Stanley staggered out of the office and down the hall. Everything in his head screamed at him to run, but he was too weak to run. The pressure inside him was building. It felt like the dolls were angry, like their many tiny fists were punching him and their many tiny feet were kicking him. Voices. Stanley's thoughts were interrupted by tiny, muffled, little girlish voices. They were muffled because they were coming from inside him. From his left arm, "I like being close to you." From his right leg, "We like you." From his belly, "You're so warm and squishy." Stanley stumbled backward, almost falling. Standing was becoming more and more difficult. The pressure was building inside him, becoming unbearable. He felt like he might explode. Could that happen? Could a person actually explode? The tiny one-armed doll was standing framed in the facility's doorway, posed like she was about to do a pirouette. The yellow irises of her cavernous black eyes focused on Stanley like lasers. Her smile was wide. She tilted her head in a way that under other circumstances might have been cute. Isn't there room for just one more? She chirped. All of Stanley's strength was gone. He fell to his knees. The one-armed doll leapt toward him with the grace of a ballerina. Stanley couldn't help it. He opened his mouth to scream. The end. Analysis time. We don't know if he actually died or not. You may have noticed I didn't have a lot to say about this story, and that's not because it's bad, the way that I think Lonely Freddy is bad. It's just a boring, nothing story. It's not written poorly, it's just a bad concept by Scott. I think it sucks that Andrea Wagner has now had to write 2 stories where the ending is extremely obvious from the start, and the reader has to pretend that we don't know what's happening to enjoy it. I don't think that's her fault, I think that's Scott's. Like, her stories are my least favorite, but I don't think that's her fault. I know a lot of people like her, and she was also chosen to write the novelization of the movie, so obviously she's liked enough by Scott. I just think so far these 2 stories have been the bad luck of the draw. Also, I gotta say that the endings are very similar, with the character hearing all these little voices around them. The only interesting thing I found in this story is that when Stanley's mother's at his apartment, he thinks to himself that he wishes he was a little boy again so his mommy could take care of him and make him all better. But he's a man, so he has to go to work, and that's when he dies. So maybe there's something in there about, like, knowing when to ask for help. Okay, so Stanley leaves the sister location bunker to go to the city diner across the street, and there's a bus stop there, and there's a lot of people watching. So we have 2 options here. Either you think this story is not games canon, unless we don't need to worry about any inconsistencies. Or, if you do think it's games canon, then you can no longer think that the Mountain Midnight Motorist is the sister location bunker entrance. Because what's described as being outside the sister location bunker in this story is not what is shown in Midnight Motorist. The city diner is not across the street from the sister location bunker. There's not a bus stop there. There's not a bunch of people walking around. I already thought that the cutscene in sister location where Mike is walking down the street and there's just a bunch of houses and people walking pretty much disproved that that little thing in the woods was the sister location bunker. But if you do think that this is canon, that's just another point in the direction of that not being the case. With that said, if you don't think that this is canon, then you can still think that Midnight Motorist is the sister location bunker. That's fine. Okay, the smelly bio-waste bin. If you think the Fun Times are actively snatching kids all over the place, then this is probably where they'd be dumping the bodies. I don't think that that's a popular theory anymore, but there you go. Another explanation might be that, like, Scott knows what it's supposed to be, but didn't tell Andrea Wagner, until maybe there's some, like, details in there that don't really fit his vision. Maybe it's Mike sleeping, or maybe it's the other people who are dying there in the sister location, like the 2 guys who get hanged. Maybe other people are getting hurt. I don't know. And if Frights fiction is the case, it could just be, like, a spooky thing like me. That's where they dump the bodies. Ooh. The last thing I want to mention is just a bit of interesting characterization. Stanley writes that letter to Amber, which is his ex, and says something interesting about his perspective on love and relationships. When you said yes, I think it was the happiest I've ever been. Amber, I know I wasn't always the best or the most exciting boyfriend, but I want you to know that I truly loved you and still do. I've been real sick lately, and if you're reading this, it's probably because something bad has happened to me. Please don't feel sad for me. I just want you to know I'm sorry I didn't make you happier and give you what you needed, but it wasn't because I didn't love you. I do, and very much. I wish you lots of happiness in your life. As much happiness as you brought me when we were together. Now, I am unmarried, and I am 29 years old. I'm not exactly the expert on love and relationships, but from my perspective, I think in a relationship, it cannot be one person's job to make the other person happy. Obviously, you should be happy with your partner, but they shouldn't be the only thing that makes you happy. Stanley seems to think that he didn't make her happy enough, while also saying that she made him happy, and so it's possible that from his perspective, the reason the relationship didn't work is because of this happiness disparity. He was disparaged about the disparity. She's providing him happiness, which is what he thinks he needs, and he was trying to provide her happiness back. But that's not what she actually needed or wanted from the relationship. So he was never going to give her what she wanted because he was being too simplistic about it. She needed something else. And when those things aren't in sync in a relationship, sometimes you can end up just being lonely. Life isn't all about joy, it's also about good health and fulfillment and feeling loved and inner peace. And Stanley doesn't know that, so he was destroyed by the inside out by some small dolls. The end. And that's room for one more, the shortest story so far. The next story is The New Kid, the longest story in the series. Buckle up. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to be nice to each other in the comments, consider supporting the creators you admire, never lose sight of the things that are important to you. Remember that Freddy's stands for Friendly, Respectful Engagement, Discussion, and Discourse Yields Success. I will see you back here next week for the next Fazbear Frights story. Hopefully, it'll be better than this one. I would like to thank my January patrons, Brandon, Sophie, and Lauren, as well as Billy, Claus, Eliza, Halmar, Johnny, Lauren, Morgan, Nan, Rhiannon, Rose, Scott, Thamgata, Zany, as well as Am Hidden, Jinx, Jose, Just That Spark, Rolo, Shadowmaster, and Tanner McCoolman, along with Jeannie and Ray.